Hey everybody, this is a piece from No Von's In the Crossfire, Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. I was going to say that this is by a Hélène Fleury, or Fleury. It says that she collaborated with No Von on his later writings. Hélène Fleury is also the author of a study, Shelley, The Mask of Anarchy, and has participated in various radical publications. So here we go. The piece is titled No Von, Relayer of Living History. No Von lived through almost the entire 20th century, 1912 to 2005, and his life and work are intimately intertwined with the revolutionary hopes and conflicts of that century. In his writings, No Von speaks not as an academically, quote, neutral, end quote, historian, but as a participant actively engaged in the events he recounts, not as a, quote, party spokesman, end quote, but as a humble individual struggling alongside so many other anonymous, unknown persons. The, quote, wretched of the earth, end quote, who are also the salt of the earth, fraternal, generous, and inventive. With them he experiences those sublime moments when people unite to attack the sources of their exploitation and enslavement, when they break through the bounds of the, quote, possible, end quote, and strive to create a life worthy of their deepest dreams and aspirations. With him, he also experiences the merciless repression the established powers invariably resort to when they sense that their system is in danger. After emigrating to France in 1948, No Von continued that struggle as a resolutely independent individual without a label or party, in groups of countless revolutionaries and alongside other rebellious workers in the factories. It was a time when anti-colonial movements in the colonized countries and the West alike were dominated by the ideology of, quote, third worldism, end quote, an ideology that obscured the real enemies while weakening or paralyzing truly radical social criticism. Faced with this situation, Von sought to transmit the real, hitherto unwritten history of Vietnam, to challenge and refute the official histories propagated by the, quote, masters of the present, end quote, and uncritically parroted in Europe and America by the self-proclaimed supporters of the, quote, struggles of the Vietnamese people, end quote. Following No Von's retirement in 1978, and with the constant support of Sophie Moen, his partner from 1952 until her death in 1994, Von devoted the next 17 years to researching and writing Vietnam 1920 to 1945, Révolution et Contre-Révolution, Sous la domination coloniale, which was published in 1995. In that book, No Von brought back to life the era of fierce class struggles that preceded the two Vietnam Wars, a period when the workers and peasants believed that putting an end to colonialism was inseparable from a social revolution. In so doing, No Von also exposed the devious maneuvers of the Communist Party as it seized control over those struggles through double-dealing, lies, intimidation, and murder. I first met Von in November 1945, and there was an immediate rapport between us, an alchemy of elective affinities and of shared dreams and convictions. Having just finished Vietnam 1920 to 1945, No Von was wondering whether to undertake an autobiographical account of the same period before returning to his more strictly, quote, objective, end quote, history. I and several of No Von's other friends convinced Von to do so. It is hard to convey just how exciting it was to share in this project, though it involved returning to the past. It was at the same time a march forward, a call for new perspectives, a defiance of time. 9 years of companionship in shared journeys, readings, writings, discoveries, friendships, ... Von's memoirs of his Vietnam years, which form the first part of the present volume, were published in 2000 under the title Au Pied de la Cloche Fêlée. The title alluded both to Baudelaire's poem La Cloche Fêlée, The Cracked Bell, and to a subversive journal of the same title, published in Vietnam in 1923 to 1926 by Nguyen An Ninh, a journal that influenced a whole generation of anti-colonial revolutionaries. No Von shared a period of detention with Nguyen An Ninh in the Saigon prison and remained permanently marked by the encounter. I should have said this at the beginning. but I'll say it now. I'm going to screw up a lot of these pronunciations. I don't know how to pronounce French words, and I don't know how to pronounce Vietnamese words, so... but hopefully it makes sense still. Having completed Au Pays de la Cloche Filet, which he considered essential in perpetuating the memory of his departed comrades, Vaughan envisaged a sequel that would recount his years in France. He did not have time to complete this project except for a few fragmentary chapters, but he had already chosen the title. As chance would have it, during the last 20 years of Vaughan's life, he lived in a small apartment on the Île de la Cité, an island in the heart of the most ancient part of Paris, near the home of the medieval philosopher Peter Abelard. Led by his insatiable curiosity, Vaughan explored the audacities and misadventures of this great spirit and of his brilliant student and secret lover, Héloïse. The story of these dissident and tragic lovers inspired the title of the second part of his autobiography, Au Pays de Héloïse, and their correspondence became part of his personal literary pantheon. Alongside the libertine poetry of Claude Le Petit, burned at the stake in 1662, the fiery poems of Louis Michel, quote, Père Duchesne, sung by the implacable Ravachol as he climbed to the guillotine, Jonathan Swift, Oscar Wilde, Celine, Travin, and last but not least, the classic Chinese writings populated with rebels, bandits, and cantankerous hermits. Ever on the lookout for sparks of poetic freedom, he was delighted to discover connections between the anarchistic Taoists of ancient China and the enemies of capitalism the world over. Vaughan's researches in this area led to the publication of an erudite study, Divination, Magie et Politique dans la Chine, or Chine Ancienne, 1976, as well as to a smaller and more accessible book, Utopie antique et guerre des paysans en Chine. A chapter is missing from Au Pays de Héloïse that Vaughan particularly wished to include, what he called, quote, the story of the book, end quote. The reputation of Vietnam 1920 to 1945 had soon spread beyond small circles of radicals to reach a much larger readership among Vietnamese people throughout the world. For many of them, the book was an unhoped-for chance to reconnect with their own history. Enthusiastic responses arrived from the diaspora and from within Vietnam itself, where a number of copies or photocopies had been smuggled in. People were moved to discover their old friends and comrades mentioned in the book by name. Researchers furnished Vaughan with precious information drawn from the difficult-to-access archives. Others provided Vaughan with dissident text, old and new, or with accounts by other survivors. Support from these diverse contexts also enabled him and his publisher friends at Insomniac to print a Vietnamese language edition of the book, making it much more accessible to the people who most directly concerned. These newfound contacts and collaborations also paved the way for several trips to Barcelona, London, Edinburgh, Boston, and New York. Vaughan was particularly interested in sharing experiences with Americans who, in their different way, had also been so strongly affected by the Vietnam War, and was thrilled to hear their stories of draft refusal, demonstrations, and other forms of anti-war resistance, both in the United States and among the soldiers of Vietnam, notably including the practice of, quote, fragging, end quote, that desperate act echoing the mutinies of 1917 to 1918, and putting into practice the famous cry, quote, let's save our bullets for our own generals, end quote. On the opposing side, too, not all the soldiers in the North Vietnamese army submissively marched off to slaughter. Although the exact number are unknown, many did indeed desert and many were executed. Vaughan was able to hear several first-hand accounts when, after 49 years of exile, Vaughan finally made a trip back to his native country in 1997. Vaughan had intended to tell the story of that visit in the second part of his autobiography, but there was not enough time. Vaughan did, however, succeed in completing the second volume of his history of 20th century Vietnam, Le Joueur des Flûtes et l'Encore Ho, Vietnam 1945 to 2005, and that book contains some references to his trip back to Vietnam, though in a less personal form. One day, as we wandered around in Hanoi, we kept running into the huge mausoleum where Ho Chi Minh's embalmed corpse is enshrined, as a fitting tribute to the despicable occupant of the temple of servile submission. Van sang Celine's Le Règlement, bracket, payback, end bracket, at the top of his lungs. And that goes, poem's lyrics are, but looking at you, I can't help asking myself, will you be any more rotten dead than alive? One of the consequences of the American intervention was that it enabled the new, quote, socialist, end quote, Republic of Vietnam to conceal the destructive nature of its own system of oppression. In Le Jeu des Flûtes et l'Encore Ho, Van shows how Ho Chi Minh rose to power and how this master of a system of coercion and terror model in Stalin's succeeded in becoming, quote, Uncle Ho, end quote, a figure admired by millions of devoted anti-imperialists around the world who either did not know anything about the Vietnamese people's actual fate or preferred to ignore it in order to avoid tarnishing the image of the charismatic leader. You know, this is just a side note for myself. There's probably a degree of ignorance, but there's also a degree of not really thinking there's anything particularly wrong with Stalinism. That's at least for lots of anti-imperialists. Ho's bloody, quote, agrarian reform, end quote, and his repression of dissident intellectuals in the mid-1950s were every bit as vicious as the repressions in other Stalinist countries during the same period, from Mao's double-crossing of the, quote, 100 Flowers movement to the Russians' crushing of the revolutionary insurrection in Hungary. And over the decades since that time, we have continued to see the same sort of sordid manipulations at the summit of the state machine, rivalries, plots, betrayals, along with a number of, quote, suicides and, quote, accidents. Upon his return to Saigon, No Van was brought close to the daily lives and working conditions of present-day Vietnamese people, thrust by the, quote, new, end quote, economy into developing projects founded by South Korean, European, American, and Japanese capital. Le Jour des Flûtes et l'Encore Ho provides numerous first-hand accounts by workers at companies like Nike or Coca-Cola, whose foreign owners are pleased at how easily the exploited workers can be kept in line by the police state machinery. The book also provides information on strikes and other signs of revolt against these conditions and against the current regime. By tragic irony of history, the heirs of the old anti-imperialist generation in Vietnam, although still professing an obligatory devotion to the memory of Uncle Ho, have turned to the country's former enemy for support, welcoming the almighty dollar while the, quote, heroic masses, end quote, continue to struggle for survival. But this newfound complicity in Vietnam between private capitalism and state capitalism came as no surprise to Van, who had always said that those enemies were in fact blood brothers. When we were in Barcelona on the occasion of the publication of the Spanish version of Au Pied de la Cloche Filet, someone asked him, quote, why, after all this time, do you so stubbornly persist in bearing witness to this past history, end quote? He replied, quote, because the world hasn't changed, end quote. During our Vietnam trip, Van returned to the village of his birth. Nieces and nephews whom Van had left as children told him candidly, often with humor, about their life during the decades of war when they had been caught in the crossfire between the Vietnamese, the Binh Xuyen pirates, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and the South Vietnamese army, in some cases joining one to protect themselves from the others, thus becoming alternately deserters and new recruits. Each night when we went back to our hotel, we first would discuss the day's events and conversations so as to compare and then record our recollections. During one of those sessions, Van described his encounter with one of his nephews. Quote, he urged me to come back and stay with them. Quote, come back and I'll build you a room. You can live with us, and when the time comes for you to die, the children will be around you as you go to your final resting place, end quote. Ancestor worship is still very strong. He wants me to be buried in the family graveyard. His idea is that in my final hour, the children and grandchildren will surround my mortal remains. We must lie among our ancestors. That way we will always feel close to them and won't be lost in the world. But me, I'm a wanderer. I've always believed that once you're gone, and there's nothing more to say. I couldn't care less about how I go." End quote. Novan. Then Novan began softly singing this fragment from Brassens, whose lyrics are in English. "I would prefer to die in water and fire anywhere at all, or even if it were possible not to die at all." Then Novan continued, quote, "It's life, the instant of life that is eternity, ... I feel immortal, I feel eternal. You may die tomorrow or right now, but when you really immerse yourself in some project, you're living beyond the 100 revolutions of the earth around the sun. Actually, time has nothing to do with it. When you're eternal, you're eternal." End quote. Novan. Thanks for listening. This has been Novan, Relayer of Living History by Hélène Fleury.